Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us for this very special edition of Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Please stay tuned after the program to find out how you can help support us, as well as we'll update you on some terrific upcoming programs. For those of you who are new to the program, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica will take as many of them as possible, like she always does so well. With that, I'd like to bring on Dan Schnur. Dan, we have a tremendous program today. You have three terrific topics. You're going to be addressing the confirmation process and what we can expect, the succession process, how that works, as well as the court's future. And all of us have been just inundated with news over the past days, and we are so looking forward as usual for you to help us navigate through this morass of information that I know you've been spending hours and hours to pull this all together for us today. So without further ado, thank you, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. As you all know, this week's Politics in the Time of Coronavirus webinar is a special RBG edition. And while Kim is correct in saying that we've got many topics to talk about today, the better way to think about it might be that we have many subtopics of one overall confirmation about the raging national debate over Justice Ginsburg's successor. And we're going to talk first about the upcoming confirmation process. After that, we'll talk second about the impact of the confirmation fight on the presidential campaign. And then third, we'll talk a little bit about the future of the court going forward. And then at that point, of course, we come to what's my favorite part of the program, is when I stop talking and start listening. And Jessica weighs in with the really smart questions that we get every week from all of you. So with that, let's get started. First of all, what will the confirmation process look like? I will say this, that barring something very, very unexpected, it appears like an almost certainty at this point that President Trump's nominee will be confirmed to the court. You never say never in politics, and as all of you know, I'm always somewhat leery to make predictions these days under any circumstances. But while there was some possibility over the first few days after Justice Ginsburg's passing that at least 4 Republicans might decide to oppose the president moving forward with the nominee before the inauguration, as I'm guessing all of you know by now, that turned out not to be the case. And while Susan Collins, the senator from Maine, involved in a very close and very difficult re-election fight, made it clear that she would oppose a nominee coming forward before the inauguration. And Lisa Murkowski, who has clashed with the president in the Trump administration in the past, well, those two came out against, but they were the only two, the only two Republican senators out of the 53 to oppose the president's ability to move forward. The two people who were being watched most closely, one, of course, is Senator Mitt Romney, who's the only Republican to vote for at least one article of impeachment earlier this year. And Romney ultimately made a decision that he announced on Tuesday morning that he would support the process going forward. Then most interesting to me was the Republican senator from the state of Colorado, Cory Gardner, who, like Collins, is involved in a very difficult re-election campaign. In fact, he's running behind his Democratic opponent, the former governor, John Hickenlooper, in that race. And there was a lot of speculation that Colorado, because Colorado, like Maine, has become increasingly more Democratic in recent years, that Gardner might decide that he too would oppose Trump in order to help attract support from undecided voters in his re-election campaign this November. Most of the other Republicans running in swing states, most of the other Republican senators with difficult re-election fights this year, were never thought seriously to consider coming out against the president's nominee, or resist the president's ability to move forward. Senator Ernst from Iowa, Senator Tillis from North Carolina, Senator McSally from Arizona, and others are all in difficult reelection campaigns as well, just like Susan Collins and just like Cory Gardner. But those states tend to be much more culturally conservative. And in states like Iowa, North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, and others, the prospect of opposing a president who's still very popular with the Republican base was something that other GOP senators decided not to do. Now, of course, the real, the most highly charged portion of the debate about whether Trump should have the ability to nominate a candidate for the bench before the election, the most significant debate was whether the Republicans 4 years ago, or I'll say this another way, how Republicans 4 years ago had opposed Barack Obama's ability to nominate a justice in an election year to replace Justice Antonin Scalia. And here now, 4 years later, deciding it was appropriate for President Trump to move forward. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has argued that because the Senate and the president are of the same party, that's a different dynamic than the one that they faced 4 years ago, when the president and Senate were of a different party. Most leading Democrats and many independent commentators have cast some doubt on Senator McConnell's explanation. My own feeling, for what it's worth, is I think that McConnell and other Republicans would have been better served simply by being more direct about it and saying in a very forthcoming way, look, when you're in charge, you get to do what you want to do. And just like when the Democrats were in charge of the Senate back in 2013 and decided to lower the threshold from 60 votes to 51 votes for confirming appellate judges, that it was equally appropriate for Republicans, their argument, not necessarily mine, to lower that threshold to confirm Justice Gorsuch and more recently Justice Kavanaugh over the last 4 years, and just as appropriate for them in the majority to decide to move forward now when they did not want to 4 years ago. So tortured logic and directness aside, at this point, a few things are very clear. Number one, the president is going to nominate a new justice, and he said he's going to do that on Saturday of this week. Second, the Senate will move forward with confirmation hearings. There's still a little bit of question on whether those hearings and the confirmation vote will take place before or after the election. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute or two. But before we go any further, I want to ask your opinion, going back to the point that I was discussing just a moment ago. I mentioned that Antonin Scalia passed away in February of 2016. So that was 9 months before the election. Obviously, Justice Ginsburg's passing was much closer to Election Day. So the question we have up for all of you to consider is, putting your own politics and partisan leanings aside, at what point before an election should a president, either a Republican or a Democrat, no longer be able to nominate a new Supreme Court justice? In other words, when is it too close to the election, and when should the president wait until his or her reelection campaign has concluded? Our options are 1 year before an election. Number two, 9 months before an election, which was the case when Merrick Garland was nominated by President Obama in 2016. 4 or 5 months before the election, sort of an in-between, maybe sometime over the summer. 6 weeks before the election, which is the timetable on which it appears the president will nominate his choice for Justice Ginsburg's successor. Or alternatively, the fifth and final choice, should a president be able to nominate a justice for consideration and confirmation at any time up until Election Day? So let's see what the results are. 8% of you say 1 year before the election. That does seem like a long time to limit a president's appointment ability to just 3/4 of their term. 9 months before the election, which is the argument that Republicans in the Senate made 4 years ago, that's 13%. Interesting, 42%, almost half of our respondents think that the appropriate timeline would be sometime over the summer, maybe in June or July. And once we get closer to a general election campaign, a president should hold off. 17% of you think the timeline that is currently in play, that President Trump and Senator McConnell are following, 17% say that 6 weeks before the election, like this current situation, is appropriate. And 19%, this is very, very fascinating, 19% say at any time up until Election Day, the president ought to be able to nominate a justice. So all told, I'll admit, a little bit of a surprise, 36, to me at least, 36% of our audience, of our participants today, would think, if you put the politics of this aside, that the timeline on which the president is operating is appropriate. By the way, before we go on with our discussion any further, as I think all of you know, the amazing Claire Krelitz is responsible for taking care of these polling questions every week. And today is Claire's 24th birthday. It is the 24th of September, and she turns 24. So Claire, we wish you a happy birthday, and we thank you for the terrific work that you always do for us in this webinar and all the other World Affairs Council programming in which you play such an instrumental role. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome, Claire. So we've got two outstanding questions, knowing the strong likelihood that a nominee will be confirmed. Question number one is the timing. And we don't know for certain yet whether the president and whether the Senate will move forward before Election Day or wait until afterwards. Lindsey Graham, who's now the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, has set hearings for the week of October 12th, so about 2 weeks out. And the idea would be that the following week, the week of the 19th, the Judiciary Committee would vote on the president's nominee, which would mean that she would be confirmed, assuming the votes are still there, in the last week of October, in all likelihood less than 1 week before the presidential election. Now, Mitch McConnell has not made a definite announcement yet on whether or not he will move forward with a vote of the full Senate to confirm before the election or not. The argument from a pure political standpoint is that a pre-election vote for Republicans could motivate their base, their strongest supporters, that a victory on the eve of the election could remind conservative voters of the importance of having a president and Senate to identify judges who reflect those conservative values. The argument for after the election, which it appears the president and McConnell are leaning away from, is that if you wait until after the election to cast the vote on confirmation, that actually incentivizes those same voters to turn out. In other words, instead of giving them their present pre-election day, which they may feel good about, maybe you wait until afterwards to incentivize them to turn out and actually vote in large numbers on Election Day. Now, there's no question, and once again, this does seem to be the direction that the Senate is leaning. Again, from a purely political standpoint, going through the entire process before the election is certainly safer, because we talked earlier about all those Republican senators who are in difficult reelection campaigns. It's entirely possible that if some of them lost their reelections, and most of them are running behind their Democratic challengers in the polls right now, if at least 2 of them lost their election and decided to change their mind, they're leaving the Senate anyway. They no longer have to be concerned about whether the president or his supporters like or dislike them. And so there's no guarantee that a defeated Republican senator would then turn around and vote against a Trump nominee. But that risk exists. And Mitch McConnell, is many things, but one of them is not a risk taker. The other dynamic in play here is that in the state of Arizona, because current Senator McSally was appointed, not elected to her seat following the death of U.S. Senator John McCain, technically an appointed senator's term can expire as soon as the day after the election, rather than waiting till January to be sworn in with the rest of the new members. And in order to make sure that votes are counted and tabulated and verified, Arizona election officials believe that if Mark Kelly, McSally's Democratic opponent, were elected on November 3rd, that he could potentially be sworn in as early as November 30th. So lots of risks involved for the Republicans in waiting. That's why it seems like they're leaning toward a pre-election process and vote. The other, of course, unresolved question, which we'll find out the answer to on Saturday, is who will be the next justice? Who will Trump nominate? And there are two individuals who are getting more speculation than anyone else. But once again, particularly with this president, you always have to be careful about predictions. The two potential nominees who are getting the most attention right now are, number one, Judge Amy Coney Barrett of the state of Indiana, who currently sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. And the other is Judge Barbara Lagoa of Florida, who sits on the Court of Appeals as well, but for the 11th Circuit in the southeastern United States. There are a few others who've been speculated about. A judge from North Carolina by the name of Allison Jones Rushing, interestingly, who's only 38 years old, a decade younger than Barrett and about 14, 15 years younger than Lagoa. And Trump, like many presidents, generally tends to try to pick a younger justice, knowing that he or she will be able to sit on the court for a long period of time to come. Right now, Barrett looks like the pretty strong favorite. And in fact, Trump mentioned yesterday that while it had been reported that he would be meeting with Judge Lagoa when he was in Florida tomorrow, he said last night that he will not be meeting with her. And the fact that he's not meeting with Judge Lagoa, who he has not met in person in the past, suggests that maybe he has already made up his mind and that Coney will be his choice. A couple of things to think about, though, since that has not yet been decided. Both are conservatives, of course, and both have been appointed by the president to their current positions. But both in their judicial careers have reflected different strains of conservatism. Amy Coney Barrett is a very strong religious conservative. She's a very devout Catholic, and in her rulings and in her writings has made it clear how important her faith is to her, and is known in particular for very conservative rulings on social and cultural matters. Judge Lagoa, on the other hand, is known more as a economic, pro-business conservative, and most of her rulings have focused on economic and regulatory issues, although it is worth noting that in Florida, she did decide not to allow convicted felons to regain their votes unless a fee or fine was paid in advance of the election. So both are very conservative, but different kinds of conservative. And the way Trump considers this, I think, tells us a lot about how he views his reelection. For the president's base, social conservatives, grassroots activists, religious conservatives, Coney is considered to be very reliable on the issues that are most important to them: abortion, marriage equality, guns, private education, and so on. Lagoa has been on the bench for a much shorter period of time than Coney has, and so she is less of a known quantity. And Republicans with long memories still remember with some regret George H.W. Bush's appointment of David Souter to the Supreme Court, who was presented at that time as a very solid, reliable conservative, and ended up not being so. So interestingly, given the two different places that Coney and Lagoa come from, there are two different parts of Trump's advisory circle who are pushing for one or the other. Coney, the social conservative, is being pushed by Trump's policy advisors because they, like her, are very conservative on these social and cultural matters and believe she'd be a more reliable court vote for many, many years to come. Politically speaking, their hope is that would motivate Trump's base of religious conservative voters and perhaps even provoke a Democratic overreach in a discussion of religion during her confirmation hearings that could lead to some backlash. Now, Trump, as all of you know, is currently running close, but running behind in some key Midwestern swing states with very heavily Catholic populations. And I'll give you just a couple of poll numbers to put that into context. 4 years ago, Donald Trump won the votes of white Catholic voters, by 23 points. Today, he's winning that same vote by 5%. And if he does not increase his margins of support among white Catholic voters, he's up 12 with all Catholics. But given the very large percentage of Latino and Latina Americans who are of the Catholic faith also, the fact that he's up 12 with all Catholics means he's only ahead 5 from white Catholic voters. And Trump needs to increase that margin if he's going to win those key swing states in the fall. On the other hand, while Trump's policy advisors are advising him, are urging him to pick Coney, his political advisors are working just as hard to convince him to pick Justice Lagoa. Judge Lagoa is of Cuban American descent. She's from the very key swing state of Florida, whereas Comey Barrett is from Indiana. And so many of Trump's political advisors feel that naming a Cuban American from Florida could help him in that state, which is also very close in the polls. It could also help him not just with Cuban American voters in Florida, but with Latino and Latina voters from other national origins and from other key swing states around the country. So one way or another, we'll know on Saturday. But what we'll learn once that decision is made is which Trump felt was more important ultimately. When push came to shove, does he believe that motivating his strongest supporters, that religious, conservative, evangelical, and Catholic vote, is more important? Or alternatively, is reaching out to undecided voters and perhaps pulling in a stronger Latino base of support? Will that be preferable? So we'll find out in 48 hours. But when the decision is made, I'm going to ask you, I think the way I'd advise you to look at it is through that lens. Okay, so we're gonna switch topics in a minute. We're going to go on to topic 2, and we're going to talk for a little bit about how that nomination, whether it's Barrett or Barrett Coney or Lagoa or someone else, how will Trump's nominee of a new justice in the confirmation fight affect the presidential campaign? Now, for just a minute, we're going to talk, and if you can hold off for just another minute before putting up that question, Claire, that would be great. We're going to talk, as we have in many times in the past, about voter motivation. As all of you know, there aren't a lot of swing voters left in this country. Most voters have made their decision for Trump or for Biden. As we talked about last week, there's still a fairly small percentage undecided. So already the election was being fought not on the basis of persuading undecided voters, but for the main, in the main, it was a contest to see who could motivate their supporters to a higher degree. So the question is who gets more excited, who gets more motivated, who gets more inspired by a Trump nominee being confirmed by the Senate? Is it progressive Democrats or is it conservative Republicans? Now, a little bit of context before we ask you your question. For many years, Republicans have put a much higher priority on the courts and on judicial nominations when considering their votes than Democrats have. That changed this year, even before Justice Ginsburg's death. For the first time in many years, Democrats actually prioritized the court as a great matter of greater concern in casting their ballots than Republicans, probably because of the nature of the Merrick Garland nomination, and in all likelihood as well by the nature of the confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh 2 years ago. So once again, who's motivated more, liberals or conservatives? Will young people, particularly young women, turn out because of their concern about issues like abortion rights, gun ownership, marriage equality issues? Will Latinos turn out in greater numbers because of concerns about how a newly configured court might act on immigration policy? Will African Americans turn out in larger numbers because of concerns about voting rights issues? Or on the flip side, as we talked about a moment ago, will religious conservatives, evangelicals, fundamentalist Catholics be more motivated to turn out because of their thoughts about the prospect of the court turning on issues like abortion, on same-sex marriage, and on religious freedom? So the question, and I don't pretend to know the answer, is who's more motivated? People who want to keep something that they already have, or people who want to gain something that they think is long overdue? So if we've got it ready, Claire, let's put up this next question. Can we make it work? Whose campaign will be helped more by the confirmation of a new justice? What do you think? Will Trump be helped more by motivating conservatives to turn out when a justice is confirmed or about to be confirmed? Or will Biden be helped more because liberals and progressives will be motivated to turn out in larger numbers because of their unhappiness with the new justice? Or alternatively, do you think that neither one of them gains more than the other? But let's see what kind of results we have. There we go. Oh, interesting. It's a pretty close split. 35% believe that Trump will benefit more by motivating conservatives. 41%, a little bit more, think Biden will gain to a greater degree by motivating progressives. And about a quarter of you say neither or the same. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to questions in just a minute. We really didn't get to the third topic about the future of the court. But what I do want to do before we open it up is to stick with this question. And we can to stick with this question about motivation, because if you assume that Trump's nominee is going to be confirmed, as I think is very likely at this point, there's already been a great deal of conversation among Democrats about what they could do in return, in response to Trump's nomination and the judge's confirmation. Since they can't stop that person from being confirmed, there's been all sorts of discussion about things they could do if Biden is elected and if Democrats regain control of the Senate. They've talked, for example, about ending the legislative filibuster in the Senate. They've talked about getting rid of the Electoral College. They've talked about increasing the number of justices on the court, which back in Franklin Roosevelt's day was known as court packing. And they've talked about possibly even adding Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as new states by a majority vote in order to strengthen their presence in the Senate. So all of these are pretty dramatic steps. And Biden himself has not come out in favor of any of them because many of his advisors believe that while Democrats would be very energized by these types of dramatic steps, a lot of swing voters might see them as overreach and it might provoke a backlash. But let's see what you think. And Claire, what we'll do is for all of you, we're gonna run through 4 questions right in a row. And after we've tested you on all 4 of these potential responses, we'll then take a look at the results. So number 1, if Trump's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to increase the number of justices on the court? What do you think, yes or no? I will make you this prediction, that the likelihood of Joe Biden being asked that question very directly by Chris Wallace during Tuesday night's presidential debate is very, very great. Second question, if Trump's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to eliminate the filibuster? Biden, I don't believe, has taken a position on this. But interestingly enough, not too long ago, former President Obama has indicated that he thinks the filibuster should be eliminated. So we'll see what you guys think. Third, if the president's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to abolish the Electoral College? This is something that many people have talked about for many years, and there's a longer conversation we can have on another day about both the cons and pros of the Electoral College. And in fact, Jessica, maybe we can make that a topic for another day, because I think it's an interesting and an important one. And then fourth and finally, if the president's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to add Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as new states? Once again, this would require a Democratic majority in the Senate and a Democratic president. But as we've seen with debates over Supreme Court justices, these types of things could now be accomplished by majority vote as well. So let's see what you guys think about all of those questions, those possibilities, and then we'll turn this into a conversation. So number one, if Trump's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to increase the number of justices on the court? 57 to 43, that's a pretty decisive majority. On the next one, if Trump's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to eliminate the filibuster? Wow, even larger numbers, almost 3/4 of the respondents of you think that the filibuster should be eliminated. What we'll have to ask another day is whether you'd want to eliminate it anyway, regardless of what Trump does with his nominee. Third question. If Trump's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to abolish the Electoral College? Once again, roughly 3/4 in favor, 1/4 against. And once again, at some point, we'll need to ask you if that's something that you would have wanted to do, regardless of a Supreme Court nomination. And then fourth and finally, if Trump's nominee is confirmed, should the Democrats try to add Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as new states? 76% yes. Wow. Once again, roughly 3/4 urging the Democrats to respond very aggressively if the president and the Republican Senate goes ahead with this nomination. Very, very interesting. Jessica, what do you think of those results?
Sorry, I wasn't quite ready. Very interesting. I think, yeah, it definitely lends itself to a future politics in the time of coronavirus discussion.
Right. And in addition to your thoughts, I imagine we have thoughts from others participating in the webinar today.
We do. And just as a side note to the fact that today is the 24th and it's also Claire's 24th birthday, this is also the 24th episode of Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. So a lot of 24s going on. Maybe if people also want to donate today, they can donate $24 and just make it a nice theme.
Or $240 or $2,400.
$24,000.
Somewhere off, who's applauding, saying, yeah, $24,000, go with it. Anyway,
thank you guys for being here. Yeah, we've got a ton of questions coming in. The first, and a couple of people asked about the Atlantic article. Things have been written recently about the possibility of Republican-controlled legislatures in swing states sending Republican slates of presidential electors to Congress in December after a narrow Biden win in their states due to late arriving mail-in ballots. Could this really happen?
Okay, so first of all, for those of you who haven't read it, there's a tremendous story in the Atlantic magazine. It'll be in their November issue, but it's already up online. An article by Barton Gellman called "The Election That Could Break America." And Gellman goes through in great detail the various scenarios that the president and/or his allies might employ in order to keep him in office. One of them, and this is something that's been a part of the Electoral College since its inception, is state legislatures have the right to decide who the electors ought to be, even if the voters themselves did not cast ballots for them. And the argument is, the questioner referenced, is if election results are in dispute in key swing states, would a Republican legislature act against the will of the people to present electors of their own? Now, the Constitution does allow for that. It's not entirely clear the circumstances under which that's allowed, nor is it clear whether a governor has a role in the process or not. So four of the six key swing states that now currently have Republican legislators have Democratic governors. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina have Republican legislators, but they all have Democratic governors. The state of Florida, on the other hand, has both the Republican governor and a Republican-controlled legislature. So one thing that would have to be clarified is, does a governor have a say in this or not? And it's fairly likely that Governor Whitmer in Michigan, Governor Evers in Wisconsin, or Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania would have something to say about this. The second thing that would have to be determined is, under what circumstances can the legislature identify a separate slate of electors? And what would almost certainly happen in those circumstances is two different groups of electors would show up in Washington in early December for what is normally just a pro forma exercise. And it would have to be determined which of those two groups did in fact represent the states from which they came. Now, of course, all of these decisions get made in the courts. And President Trump has made it very clear in recent days that one of the reasons that he wants, perhaps the main reason that he wants the Senate to confirm his nominee before the election, is that so she can be on the bench to help in the adjudication of these matters. We don't know yet how all this would play out. We don't know if Republican legislators would nominate their own electors, how close the election would have to be, or how the courts would rule. But I would encourage you to read the article because it's a fascinating study, and it is something that's going to be important for us to keep an eye on in the weeks up to the election, because like so many of these questions, there really is no precedent for how they'd be resolved.
Thank you. Can you talk about the impact this could cause by taking Kamala Harris off of the campaign trail if she is called back to DC for the Senate hearing?
Well, so it's a great question, and it's one that affects not just Harris, but it's one that affects every member of the Judiciary Committee, both Republican and Democrat, many of whom are in the middle of difficult re-election fights, including the Judiciary Chair, Lindsey Graham. And then, of course, when the Senate comes back for a full vote, it's unlikely that that takes place in an hour or two. Even on an accelerated timeline, it's likely that there would be days of debate before the vote was taken. So many members, all members of the Senate, would be off the campaign trail. So it's a particular challenge for Harris, but it's not a unique one. And one of the things that McConnell will have to weigh going forward is how much time his endangered senators, Gardner, McSally, Ernst, the others we've talked about, how much time they can afford to be away from the campaign trail, even given such a critical vote. As it relates to Harris, so first of all, Kamala Harris is not running for re-election to the Senate. She was re-elected here 4 years ago. More importantly, though, vice presidential nominees, with the exception of the one debate that the two running mates have in October of every election year, most running mates don't get a great deal of attention during presidential campaigns. Their announcements are a really big deal. Then the debate gets a lot of attention. And then that's really it. They're off campaigning, but they don't get noticed nearly as much as the presidential nominees do for obvious reasons. If you think about Kamala Harris's political history since coming to the Senate, I'd offer you two things to consider. One, in Harris's presidential campaign, I would say that her performance on the trail was uneven. She had some very, very impressive moments and others in which she really struggled. But if you look at her career in the Senate, where Harris has shined the most, where she has impressed so many people, is in her questioning of witnesses before the Senate, before the Judiciary Committee. Her questioning of Brett Kavanaugh, her questioning of James Comey, her questioning of Jefferson Sessions attracted raves from Democratic Party regulars and many others as well. And so I wonder if Harris, having this kind of very unique, even unprecedented platform in the middle of a presidential campaign to very sharply question the president's court nominee, could end up being of some benefit to the Biden-Harris ticket.
Thank you. What reason did Obama give for not fighting to fulfill the empty seat on the Supreme Court? Was his reasoning worth the loss of the seat?
My guess, and it is just a guess, is that Obama realized that even the bully pulpit of the presidency was not going to convince a majority of US senators to change their mind. And that if he devoted a great deal of time in the election year to arguing about the court, number one, he wasn't going to convince them to move forward. So it would have been a losing effort. Second, by taking that fight and then losing it, it would have made him look weak in the minds of many voters. And that's not the image that a president wants to give off in the middle of a re-election campaign. And third, the Obama campaign believed, correctly as it turns out, that the issues on which they were going to beat Mitt Romney were not issues relating to the Supreme Court, but issues relating to healthcare, issues relating to economic growth, and other matters of public policy. And the more time they spend arguing with Mitch McConnell about the future of the Supreme Court, the less time the president would have to be arguing about why his vision of America on these other policy matters was superior to that of Romney's. Hindsight being 2020, you can make a case that it might have been worth him taking the fight to McConnell, even if unsuccessful. But Obama was reelected. And while Garland was not confirmed on the court, if you're President Obama or one of his advisors, you could argue that the 2016 year turned out about as well as it possibly could from their perspective.
Thank you. Who do you think has the advantage in the upcoming presidential VP debates? How much do you think these debates matter this time around compared to previous elections? I know that was going to be one of our topics today before the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so I know we're going to try to talk about it next Thursday as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about the first debate in next Thursday's webinar. But I would argue to you that while presidential debates, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, presidential debates really don't make a lot of difference in most years. They don't change a lot of votes. And you could actually make a case that it would be necessary to go back to 1976 when President Gerald Ford was running for re-election. And Ford infamously, mistakenly asserted that Poland was not under the control of the then Soviet Union, which is obviously incorrect and a misstatement. But Ford had been making up ground very quickly in the polls against the challenger Jimmy Carter. And that misstep seemed to arrest his climb. And ultimately, Carter was elected by a relatively narrow margin. I don't know that you can point to a moment in presidential debate since then in which the debate has had a material impact on the outcome of the election. As I think I've told this group before, or as I've suggested to this group before, that if something happens only once every 44 years, it is probably more the exception than the rule. Same thing, even to an even greater degree, vice presidential debates. There's all sorts of speculation on whether Pence, who is a little quieter, but perhaps more solid, or Harris, who can be more sharp-edged and more aggressive, whether one or the other has the advantage going in. But even probably the most famous moment in vice presidential debate history is when Lloyd Bentsen, the senator from Texas, who was Michael Dukakis's running mate in 1988, dismissed then Senator, soon-to-be Vice President Dan Quayle, by saying, I knew Jack Kennedy, you're no Jack Kennedy. That was a very powerful moment, perhaps the most powerful moment in vice presidential debate history. Obviously did not impact the outcome of that election at all. All that said, I think this year the debates matter more than most, much more than most, particularly the three presidential debates between Biden and Trump. And the reason for that is because of the pandemic, we've seen much less of the candidates than we normally would in election years. Both of them have begun campaigning again, sometimes in person, sometimes on video. But until recently, we haven't seen them as much on a regular basis as we would have under more normal circumstances. And so if you think about these three debates representing a larger percentage of the overall exposure that most voters have to the candidates, they could make a much larger difference this year. But we'll have a much better sense of that a week from now, won't we?
We will, and I will be doing my debate bingo card workout next Tuesday. So if anyone wants a copy of that, I can email it to them. I love watching the debates, so I'm looking forward to it. Our next question: should the latest Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement, recuse themselves from any 2020 election decision put before the Supreme Court?
First of all, I think it's unlikely that it would happen. If a justice is confirmed before November 3rd, I think it's very certain that she would feel comfortable ruling on election-related matter. And I don't know. I haven't heard a persuasive constitutional argument as to why that should not be the case. There are many matters on which justices should recuse themselves, but unless Justice Ginsburg's successor has played some type of role in the election up until being nominated, I don't know what the constitutional basis would be for that type of recusal.
Thank you. Can Trump really hold up the presidential inauguration with court fights? And then somebody else also asked, sorry, I think I lost the other question. Can a president who loses the election still nominate a justice after the election?
I'll answer the second question first. Technically, and it wasn't one of our options on the first poll question, technically a president can nominate a Supreme Court justice until noon on January 20th. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Senate will act on that nomination, but the president is given this power by the Constitution. And not only does that power not expire on Election Day, it doesn't expire until they are no longer president. The first of the two questions, I think the answer is no also, or at least very unlikely. Trump will almost, if Trump does believe that he's going to be defeated, I think he's almost certain to employ any number of legal methods in order to challenge the results. But if those legal proceedings are not completed by Inauguration Day, the Constitution still makes it very clear that a president of the United States is to be sworn in on January 20th. And so if that's the case, there's one of two scenarios. And we're going to assume that Trump is taking legal action because he believes he was defeated. Obviously, if he wins, he will be sworn in for another 4 years. But if he's pursuing legal action, which means he's probably lost, that means that, or that he thinks he's probably lost, that means one of two situations. One, it means that Biden has won. And even while court proceedings can go on for months, if not years after the election, the Constitution requires a new president to be sworn into office. And so even if it were to be under a legal cloud, Biden would be sworn in at noon on the 20th. If the results are unclear, and we talked about this in one of our very first webinars, I think back in March. It's hard to believe that was 22, 23 webinars ago, huh, Jessica? We talked about this a little bit then. What if the election is not resolved and this type of legal fight is taking place, but without a clear winner? Well, Trump does not stay in office under those circumstances either. The Constitution once again makes it very clear that his term expires, as does Vice President Pence, at noon on January 20th. So if the election were still unresolved, there's any number of, let's say, constitutional possibilities that have been argued by people who study such things. The most logical is that Nancy Pelosi, who as the Speaker of the House of Representatives is third in the line of succession to the presidency, the common assumption is that she would become president of the United States on an acting basis and would serve until ultimately it was resolved on whether Trump or Biden had won. But there are any number of constitutional scholars who point out that if the election results have not yet been validated, then the elections for president are not just in question, but the elections for Congress are still in question as well, which means just as Donald Trump could no longer continue as president on January 20th, that Nancy Pelosi, as of, I believe, January 4th, would no longer be a member of the House of Representatives since those elections had not been certified. What that means is fourth in line to the presidency, after the president, after the vice president, after the Speaker of the House of Representatives, is the President pro tem of the United States Senate. That's not the Senate Majority Leader, as I think most of you know. Rather, it's the senator from the majority party who has served for the longest period of time. So who is the Senate President pro tem? Currently, the longest serving Republican senator, because Republicans are in the majority, is Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa. That said, if the presidential election hasn't been certified, if the House elections haven't been certified, that means the Senate elections will not have been certified either. And that means the 35 senators who are on the ballot this fall would no longer be serving in the Senate either, because their terms would have expired. At that point, and I realize this gets a little bit confusing, because there are more Republicans running for re-election this year than Democrats, if the Senate were reduced from 100 members to 65 members, including only those who were not on the ballot in November 2020, then the Democrats would have a majority. And the Democratic senator with the longest time of service is Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And so if you really want to amaze your friends, you can tell them that if the presidential election is not resolved by Inauguration Day, that Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, more likely than not, would become the acting president of the United States. Huh.
I'm going to have to watch that a couple of times. I can make sure I caught all of that. That was a lot of information. Fascinating, fascinating. What are the reasons for and reasons against increasing the number of judges on the Supreme Court?
Well, the argument in favor of increasing the number of judges is simply that the Constitution never determined what the ideal number should be. And in fact, for the first roughly 100 years of the Republic, the number of judges varied greatly. It started at 6 back in the 18th century, and any number of adjustments were made over the next 100 years or so. The Congress settled on 9 almost arbitrarily in the late 19th century. And so while it's a matter of statute, not a matter of not prescribed by the Constitution, it's almost an arbitrary decision. And there's 2 arguments that can be made in favor of expanding the court. One is a very partisan one, that just as Roosevelt wanted to do back during his presidency, it would allow a sitting president to regain a majority on the court simply by nominating more people. And so if President Biden and the Democratic Senate were to decide to add 5 members to the court, the president would appoint all 5 members, and then the Democrats would have that majority back. The other argument, less partisan and more principled, is that this is a much larger, much more complicated country than it was 240 years ago, and that 9 individuals simply cannot represent the breadth of perspective, the breadth of experience that a country of our size and diversity maintains. And so having a larger court would allow for a greater diversity of voices. The argument against is that it becomes a never-ending cycle. And if the Democrats were to add judges to give their president a majority in 2021, then the next time there was a Republican Senate and a Republican president, the court would be expanded even further to give that Republican president the ability to nominate more judges to make a majority. And at a certain point, you would have a Supreme Court that was so large that it would be impossible to function. What it comes down to, just in the matter of pure political practicality, is for Democrats to decide what is less difficult, what is less onerous for us. Are we better off tolerating a court with 6 Republican nominated justices and only 3 Democrats? Are we better off tolerating that in order to preserve of a court of a certain size and effectiveness, for lack of a better term? Or would the policy outcomes of that court be so onerous to Democrats that it would be worth potentially compromising the effectiveness of the court in the future in order to avoid some of those policy decisions, at least until there was a Republican Senate and Republican president again?
Thank you. The judicial appointment system collapsed when the filibuster was removed. This was the original sin. Can it ever be reinstated as part of a grand bargain?
And this is the question that I think the most principled people in both parties are asking right now, which is, rather than continuing to devolve into more and more factionalism and more distrust, is there an opportunity at some point in the future to begin to restore some of the protections that the Constitution originally provided? One of the most fascinating proposals I've seen, and I have to admit I haven't had enough time to read or think about it to decide whether it's something that I'd personally support, but I'll offer it to all of you for consideration. One proposal that's been forwarded as it relates to the court is by those who have pointed out that the average lifespan of a human being in the 1780s was roughly 40 years old. Today in 2020, it's almost twice that. And so a lifetime appointment in 2020 is a much different thing than our country's founders envisioned. And so what's been proposed, there've been all sorts of term limits for judges proposed, but the alternative I find the most interesting is one that would set up a to prescribe term in all likelihood 18 years for a Supreme Court justice. And once he or she was confirmed, they would serve for 18 years. And every 2 years, the most senior justice would retire and would either return to another place in the judiciary or simply to go back to private life. And what that means is that every 2 years, a president would nominate a Supreme Court justice. Every 2 years, the Senate would act on that nomination. And rather than playing sort of actuarial roulette with the lifespan of 9 individuals, and some presidents getting more appointees and some getting less just because of sheer fate, it becomes an ongoing part of the cycle in which a president, when he or she's elected, know that they will have 2 Supreme Court nominations over the course of their term, 2 more should they win re-election. And that would eliminate a lot of the guesswork. That's not restoring a previously held principle, but it's the kind of thinking, I believe, that can ultimately get us out of such a difficult and problematic situation.
I like that. It seems more systematized and a little bit more predictable, so the voters would actually have a little bit more, I guess, less to react to based on things like that. So anyway, I've taken you all the way to the end of the hour, so I will turn this back over to Kim. But Dan, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us today as well. Thank you.
And thank you, Jessica. You do such a terrific job with these questions. You get hundreds of them, so kudos. Dan, thank you. You're providing clarity. It's still, I still feel like we need to buckle our seatbelts. It's going to be a rough ride over the next weeks, but we're so glad to have you to guide us through this. So can't wait for next week.
It is a great deal, Kim. If you and I a week ago today had asked ourselves, recession, pandemic, racial and urban challenges, oh my goodness, what else could happen? Well, now we know. And a Supreme Court nomination in the middle of all the rest of this makes the next several weeks even more tricky to navigate. And for all of you, we'll do our best every Thursday to try to navigate it with you. Next week, in addition to talking about the president's nominee, who we will know by then, we'll also be talking about the first presidential debate. And my guess is, Kim, between you and I, we can come up with another pretty good topic too.
That we can. I think you should start on your book now, the year 2020, and get a head start on everyone else who's going to be making movies of it and analyzing this ad nauseum.
If I'd written it as a novel, I don't know. If I'd written it as a novel, I don't think anyone would have believed it.
Okay. For our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. I thought Jessica's idea of giving $24 in honor of Claire's birthday, and it's Dan's 24th live stream, and it's the 24th day of September, is a great idea. So if you're so inclined, please text the name Schnur, S-C-H-N-U-R, to the number on the screen, and please give what you can to help us keep these wonderful programs going. We have a terrific lineup. In addition, of course, we just talked about Dan's ongoing politics in the time of coronavirus every Thursday at 11. On September 29th, we have California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. October 6th, a conversation with Pete Buttigieg. On October 13th, we have our election series that Dan's very going to be moderating a lot of, I think all of the programs in October. And on October 13th, it's key swing states of the 2020 election. On 10/20, Ron Brownstein and Dan will be talking about who will decide the presidential election. And October 27th, how the media will influence the election. So please go to our website at lawacth.org, register today, become a member, make a donation. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed. And we hope to see you soon. Dan, thank you so much again. Take care, everyone.
Everybody.